So the title of my speech is called The People's Process. It's by T.C. Bell. Thank you so much for that. According to a recent article by Eliza Collins in USA Today, the two major party political nominees for president are, quote, the two most unfavorable presidential candidates in more than 30 years, end quote. With unfavorability ratings reaching nearly 60% for both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, it is not surprising that these two candidates are so contentious to the majority of American voters. Especially when we consider a recent New York Times article titled, "Only 9% of Americans chose Trump or Clinton as the nominee during the primary process," we can really start to put this picture together to see how at the general election time, millions of Americans are scratching their heads, asking themselves how we ended up with such unpopular candidates for the most powerful position in the land. The presidential primary process is a long and convoluted series of elections that eventually results in the nomination of individuals who compete directly for the majority of 538 Electoral College votes. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to describe some of the primary's rules and restrictions that essentially creates a series of filters on our democracy. Afterwards, hopefully each and every one of you will have more insight into how to have your voice heard more effectively in our system of government. The political process of the primary starts in a presidential election year, the very beginning of the year, typically in January or February. What happens is when individuals go and vote for their candidate of their choice, they're only actually electing a delegate or a representative to go to the next stage of the process with the hopes that that person is going to continue voting for the candidate of your choice. So when the process opens up, the field is usually pretty large because there's lots of candidates running, which then gives voters a wide array of viewpoints to choose from. It's at this point in the process when individual citizens have the most influence on our form of government. But as this chart indicates here, the majority of Americans are not participating. And that's understandable, because the way that it's set up is that each individual state is responsible for managing the election of these delegates. So we have 50 different states. You essentially have 50 different state governments setting up 50 different types of rules to elect these representative people. Most of the states have chosen two forms of conducting these elections. One is called a caucus, the other is called a primary election. A caucus is a meeting that takes place at a specific time and at a certain place. Voters have to be present in order to participate, and they also must be registered with a specific political party. Very, very few states offer proxy voters for people who are not able to attend the caucus, and even fewer states allow for caucus goers to send in absentee ballots if they're not going to be able to attend because of work, religious functions, or because they're out of town. The other way to conduct a primary election is to do just that, is hold what's called a primary election, which is just like a general election in the sense that the polls are open all day until the early evening. And most states even allow for mail-in voting that's early in primary elections. There are open primaries and there are closed primaries. An open primary allows unaffiliated voters and independent voters the right to participate as well if they choose one major party that they want to vote in. Whereas a closed primary process only allows registered members of a specific party to participate, thus shutting out unaffiliated voters and independents from the most influential portion of the process. After a caucus or a primary is held, what happens is those delegates that are elected then proceed to more series of conventions, these meetings, where again they are just gathering together and electing, that's right, more delegates. The delegates this time is a smaller number of people, and they'll go to specific conventions. The first meeting that's held after the caucus or primary is called a county convention. And it's there where delegates are then sent to either a state convention or a congressional district convention. At a congressional district convention, the delegates then meet again and select a smaller number of delegates that then proceed to the national convention. A state convention is either held before or after a series of congressional district conventions, and it's there where they elect a larger number of what they call quote-unquote at-large delegates who are representing the entire state. Those delegates then proceed on to the national convention as well. It's at the national convention when the nominations is finally made, when all of the delegates that have been brought together from throughout the country gather and finally cast their votes for the nominee of the party. In this country, the two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are legally allowed to conduct the rules that govern the election of their delegates any way they want. On the Democratic side, they have a proportional rule in effect in each and every state, which means that each delegation that is elected at every single level must be evenly split between men and women, and that the numbers of those delegations are based on the votes that the candidates received. So that if candidate A receives 52% of the vote on primary or caucus day, they will receive 52% of the delegates up for grab. This is only on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, the party allows for each state party to set up its own rules that governs the election of that state's delegates. Also, which is very important when considering the Republican experience, there is no idea of proportionality built into their system, which means that it gives more emphasis on organizational skills rather than just getting people out and voting. Both parties have been heavily criticized for these forms that they run to nominate their presidential nominees because they're not truly representative. The Democrats get criticized because they use what's called a superdelegate system, which gives extra weight to the votes cast by elected officials and party leaders. Whereas Republicans are heavily criticized because their national delegations are typically made up of older white men. After the nominations of both parties are taking place, a general election is then held on the first Tuesday of November. What's surprising to most people about our general elections here in this country is that the winner of a plurality of votes is not the president. The person who becomes the president must win a majority of the 538 Electoral College votes that are up for grabs. So to become the president, you must be the first person to win 270 Electoral College votes. The person who wins the majority of votes in a specific state then wins the Electoral College votes from that one state. But that does not necessarily mean that the person who wins the majority of the entire country will then win. Just like the parties are criticized for not being truly representative, our Electoral College system is also heavily criticized by political scientists because it is not truly democratic in the sense that we think of when we think of the word democracy. So, we obviously have some extreme flaws in our system, especially the fact that for voters who wait until general elections to have their voice heard for the very first time, by waiting for all those filters to be applied to the process, they are essentially having their voice eliminated from the process. Even though they're going out and voting, they didn't take the time to have their voice heard at the earlier stages when their views and their concerns about the problems facing America and its citizens would most likely have had an effect. So, going forward in this country, as we try to expand the franchise to as many people as possible, like we've done throughout the course of our nation's history, it's imperative that all of us take the time and the effort to not only participate in caucuses and primaries, but also to push our elected officials and party leaders to expand the process and open it up to unaffiliated and independent voters who, as time continues to go by, are becoming the majority of voters in this country. Thank you so much for your time today, and hopefully you can take what you've learned today and teach other of your neighbors and citizens on how they can most effectively have their voice heard in our political system.